very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on the tragedy that struck Turkey and Syria just a few weeks ago. This is an unfolding tragedy with numerous multi-layered implications for both countries, but also the wider region, which is why I'm delighted on behalf of my colleagues at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs to be chairing and hosting this discussion. Before anything else, in fact, since this is an unfolding tragedy, let me, on behalf of all our colleagues at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, express our heartfelt and sincere condolences, sympathies to all those who are affected by this tragedy, including our friend and a dear member of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs family, Alaaldin, who was personally affected by this tragedy. The topic is a challenging one, no doubt. Natural disasters are more than just natural disasters. They have wide-ranging political implications, something we'll be looking at in relation to both Turkey and Syria rather closely. They have repercussions for economies, and most certainly implications for security, which is something we'll be looking particularly at in the context of Syria, where the population has suffered at least a decade of bloodletting and civil war. The speakers we've gathered today in many ways reflect the different layers to this topic, to this discussion. We're delighted to be joined by Piotr Zalewski of The Economist. He's a longtime Turkey expert and follower. A very warm welcome to you, Piotr. We're also very pleased to be joined by Asli Aydintasbas, who is joining us from the US, but also soon to be Turkey, a widely accomplished and recognized expert on Turkey and the wider region. She's with the Brookings Institution and was previously with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Last but most certainly not least is Sara Kayyali, who's a human rights lawyer and analyst. She was previously with Human Rights Watch and the Open Society Foundation, where she worked closely with civil society in Syria and the wider Middle East. The discussion itself will be looking at short and long-term repercussions that this tragedy may inflict on both countries and the wider region. This includes a look at the reaction to the earthquake from the region and the wider international community. Here, the difference between the aftermath in Turkey and Syria couldn't be more marked, given the delay given the delays in which through which aid was delivered as a result of a combination of the Assad regime's weaponization of aid, as a result of the complexities, to put it lightly, of UN procedures, and of course the challenges and complexities that come with delivering aid to a country that continues to be in the midst of conflict. The economic cost of this tragedy, of the earthquake, cannot be overstated. Estimates range from around $30 to $60 billion. That's for Turkey only, where the death toll continues to rise and stands at around 51,000 plus. Again, in Syria, the number stands at around 7,000, but there the challenges will be very different to those in Turkey, which again is why I'm very pleased to see that we have such an esteemed group of experts who can unpack the different layers to this unfolding issue. Before we begin with you, Piotr, let me point out to our audience members that this event is being live streamed on YouTube, and there's also simultaneous translation for those of you who want to tune in into the Arabic translation. Piotr, let me come straight to you as somebody who's been on the ground, who was on the ground before the earthquake struck, after the earthquake struck. Can you give us a progress update on where things currently stand in Turkey and what the next steps really are beyond, of course, the recovery and reconstruction and rescue efforts? The floor is yours, Piotr.
think I've unmuted myself. Well, look, it's one of the things that terrified me about the subject of this panel was the idea of looking into long-term consequences of the earthquake, because the long term in Turkey doesn't really exist at this point, whether we're looking at the earthquake or something else. I remember a few months ago, one of our financial columnists was in town, and we had meetings with economists, finance people, bankers, and the like, and they were giving a rather grim prognosis of Turkey's long-term economic prospects. And our financial columnist was a bit puzzled because he thought, as one does, that Turkey's economic prospects over the long term, with a good demographic structure and the like, are actually quite bright. And it took him, I think, a while to figure out that for his interlocutors, the long term was 3 months. Let's not forget that Turkey is a country that over the past few years alone has faced an attempted coup, wars in Syria, Libya, Caucasus, at least 2 currency crises, a refugee crisis, an unprecedented wave of terrorist attacks, and COVID, and now the deadliest earthquake in its modern history. So in other words, this is a country whose attention span has been broken. So we can speculate about the long-term impact of the earthquake, but I think I should say that this is simply not a conversation that is being had in Turkey today. There's no room for the long term. The long term for Turkey right now is the elections, meaning most likely May 14th, perhaps June 18th, so 3-4 months from now. That is the long term. And so, if you'll have to excuse me, but perhaps for the duration of the conference, when I'll be referring to the long term, I'll probably be referring to the long term in Turkish terms. Anyway, but before we get there, just to take stock of the situation, I think, as you asked me to do, the scale of the destruction is really hard to wrap one's mind around. I mean, we have the figures of the cost to the economy, estimates, very early estimates. We have the number of damaged, destroyed buildings. I think that's a number that people put at, or experts put at, well over 100,000. Those are buildings that are damaged, destroyed, meaning entirely collapsed, or perhaps on the verge of collapse, or slated to be demolished. But I was traveling through the earthquake area for the first week. I was in Adana, then went to Antakya, then Osmaniye, Kahramanmaraş, Adıyaman. This is, and all the way to Diyarbakir. This is an area about 500 kilometers long, from east to west, and you see destruction at every step of the way. From cities like Gaziantep, where I am now, where maybe a few dozen buildings were destroyed, to cities like Antakya, where literally every other building has been leveled. Adıyaman, similar. I think the official estimate in Antakya is 44% of buildings that are destroyed or damaged. These are figures, by the way, you can find not only in Turkish sources, but in a recent World Bank report. That report, which just came out yesterday, estimates the damage to the economy at roughly $34 billion. That's 4% of Turkey's GDP, 2021. And the cost to the economy in terms of reconstruction is probably going to be twice that, meaning up to $80 billion. So, and even then, we're not yet able to grasp the full sort of economic implications. we have some idea, but only a very faint one, of the possible political implications. And let me just say that the consensus in Turkey is that the emergency response was inadequate. I'm looking at a poll, I think one of the few polls conducted on this, that suggests that 88% of respondents believe the Turkish government was not prepared for the earthquakes, and 59% believed corruption in state institutions made them deadlier. That's to say that the consensus was that, or is that, the response was inadequate. The only question is how badly inadequate it was and what were the contributing factors, one of which was obviously the scale of the earthquake. But obviously there were major problems with preparedness or lack thereof. The response was, in many cases, in many cities, woefully late. I mean, I remember arriving in Antakya, I think the second day of the earthquake, and there were just some emergency teams on the outskirts of the city, and the city center. There were some maybe firefighters from nearby municipalities, but there were no big rescue teams. The National Disaster Agency was nowhere to be seen. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details, but some of the scenes that one could witness in Antakya and in Adıyaman, and a lot of these other places in the first 2-3 days, where really are hard to describe. I mean, we're talking about corpses wrapped in blankets on the streets, sort of waiting to be retrieved. We're talking about people who are wounded and waiting for help to arrive, and before help arrived, those people died. And there is a growing backlash in response to this. Now, there's it's not a backlash that makes it inconceivable for President Erdogan, the AK Party, to win in the elections, but it will make it much harder. There's enough blame to go around, sir, between generations of corrupt or incompetent developers and contractors, between local politicians, inspectors, companies that specialize in inspection, and the national government. But the early signs certainly suggest that most of the anger is being directed toward the government, which had 20 years to prepare for this earthquake and did not. And at the same time presided over a construction frenzy, rather uncontrolled construction frenzy over the past couple of decades. I don't know how we are doing in terms of time, but I mean, I think there's a range of other topics we're likely to discuss. I think one of them will be the Syrian issue, as you alluded to, Ranj, and the Syrian issue in Turkey. I think there will be room to discuss the impact on the demography of these regions, and maybe some more room to discuss reconstruction and the larger sort of economic fallout. But I'll leave that for my fellow panelists and maybe for the second half of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Piotr. That's extremely helpful indeed. And sometimes I think devastation doesn't really capture the true essence of this crisis and its repercussions in the years and decades to come. Asli, it would be great to get your reaction, I guess, to Piotr, and maybe at the same time tie in what's happening to the wider regional dynamics. I found it quite encouraging that, of course, this applies mostly to Turkey, quite encouraging that the region had mobilized a lot of support, material assistance, political and so on and so forth, quite rapidly in response to this crisis. And for the optimists, this is an indication of the region's potential to put political differences to one side, most notably in the case of Turkey and Greece, for example, and actually address the immediate needs of the wider population. Maybe you think that's a bit too optimistic or rose-tinted. But needless to say that the numbers were there, and the rhetoric and the material assistance itself was there. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that and the wider foreign policy dynamics of this crisis.
Thank you, Ranj. And there is plenty for optimists in terms of regional reaction and, sort of thaw in relations between Turkey and Greece, Turkey and Israel, etc. But plenty also for pessimists. And if you are in Turkey, and I just arrived from Washington, it's hard not to feel the deep suffering in the country that is going to be around for many years, I think. Problems that this has brought to surface are not just, about this government, it's systemic issues, institutional collapse. I think Turks had to face that some of these institutions were hollowed out, whether it's the search and rescue, Turkish Red Crescent, huge debates in the country. And Turkey is going to be inward looking for quite some time in a way that is directly at odds with the image it's been building up, the image that government has been telling its people that we are, a rising power. We have drones, we have military outposts in Syria, in Libya, and we are going to start an Antarctica program and a space program and leader of the century and all of that. And all of a sudden that image of a rising Turkey has been shattered and in ways that have really not just devastated people, but also I think it's been a day of reckoning for many in a position of power as well, because here you are talking about a space program, here you are talking about great power competition in 21st century being the century of Turkey, which is what a recent video government materials were talking about. And then earthquake happens and people cannot get hold of tents or find search and rescue teams or even aid or for days. So this kind of inward looking self-inquiry, some of it directed at the government, some of it just sort of a circular firing squad right now. Everyone is going to consume much of Turkey's energy, I have to say. This country lives at an earthquake seismic zone. So we always know that there will be a mega earthquake in Istanbul. And in 1999, there was a big one near Istanbul. And ever since, people have been talking about a big earthquake in Istanbul, which will still happen. It's just that people had stopped paying attention to other parts of Turkey in the way Ottomans had 500 years ago, in the way Byzants had, Romans had. Historically, every 500 years, this region is struck by a major earthquake. And if human race does not eradicate itself from the planet, there will be another mega earthquake in that area 500 years from now. The question is, what are the political repercussions? I agree with Piotr. It is too early to tell. But if you ask me what Turks are talking about, it is very much the elections, because the debate about earthquake, was there enough tents? Did Erdogan do the right thing by not, calling the military early on? Are these institutions hollowed out? So all of that has now morphed into the domestic election debate. And this is already a very polarized country, and this has been for some time, and polls are indicating that as well. Polls are indicating that the country is really split, not so much in half, maybe, the governing coalition has certainly, the election is for the opposition, to lose. In other words, the opposition party and the Kurdish vote together with the Kurdish vote seems to have the majority right now. Another way of putting it is President Erdogan is facing an anti-Erdogan majority at the moment. But natural disasters work in both ways. You will have millions of people over the next couple of months that will be looking at government, the state, for housing, for stipend, for reconstruction, for everything. And it's not easy to tell that the anger that we see in these areas right now will necessarily translate into an election win for the opposition. That on the domestic component, but I think, and the shattering of Turkey's self-image as a rising power, and perhaps questions about the governance model. Let's not forget that everyone I talk to in Turkey is questioning, even some government officials, the structure, the constitutional framework that was created in 2017 with the referendum, whereby every decision is centralized. And it turns out that there are situations in life, such as natural disasters, where you need local agency, you need NGOs. Turkey does need NGOs. Turkey does need civil society and all of that. But in terms of external relations, and whether your more optimistic take is going to last, is going to have a lasting power, it is too early to tell. Turkey will certainly need its neighbors. Turkey will need Western funds and regional funds. I think there is every desire to continue with regional normalization. That is the case. But also, I think perhaps, Turkey will, whether it's before the elections or after the elections, cannot be oblivious to the kind of, restructuring, reconstruction funds that are going to be put on the table from international organizations or EU and the West in general. So that will definitely be part of the external calculus. But Turkey will be competing with Syria for reconstruction. Turkey will be competing with Ukraine for reconstruction funds, because Ukraine, there is both the military component of the aid and weapons aid that goes on, but also reconstruction funds that have started flowing into the country, because so much of the Russian attack on that country has been about infrastructure and all. So it's not going to be easy, and I think that with Greece, it's definitely a very good sign that we had search and rescue teams from Greece, from Israel, from Armenia, some of Turkey's more troubled neighbors. And if the government was to go back to something that resembles a zero problems with neighbors policy, including Syria, by the way, there's enormous public support for that. But next few months, Turks will not be thinking about foreign policy. They'll be thinking about who to vote and who not to vote. More on who not to vote. This election season will be driven by who you hate rather than who you want. And I think that one thing I can say is about the region in particular and about Turkey's relations with the West. What I see from the opposition, and I think Turkey is a country where you cannot rule out opposition coming to power. Often it's lumped together with, and sometimes with Russia and, more other illiberal regimes, but Turkey is certainly unique in that, also different from regional regimes, in that elections can make a difference. And one thing that we can say that there is support for regional normalization, both on the government side and on the opposition side. The opposition is very clear that they also want to normalize Turkey's relations with Middle East actors. And if it's in terms of relations with the West, I think it's about managing differences, issues like Sweden and Finland's EU, NATO accession that will be on the forefront, and also issues that have to be to do with support for Turkish economy over the next few months, but really also after the election, in which some people and many economists and most people who have any knowledge of the economy are telling me Turkish economy will face a tougher scene after the elections and will need a serious amount of external funding. So maybe let me stop there, and we can touch upon the other aspects in Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Asli. The appraisal of the nexus between the domestic political climate and the wider foreign policy dynamics was most helpful. And it'd be great to get Peter's reaction to some of your remarks and analysis at some point. Let's jump straight to you, Sara. I know you've been waiting rather patiently. In many ways, the picture couldn't be more different in Syria. And sadly, it seemed for those of us who have been following Syria for quite some time over the years that there wasn't anything particularly surprising about the events that unfolded after the earthquake. Syria policymakers have been here before when it comes to the provisioning of aid, when it comes to mobilizing support and resources to populations that desperately need them. However, this is somewhat different to a conflict. It needs different processes, mitigation mechanisms, et cetera, given that it's a natural disaster. Part of me feels like we will be going back to the politics behind it all and the legacy of the past 10 years of conflict as we analyze and appraise the reverberations of this tragedy. But it'd be great to get some clarity from you, in fact, on the circumstances that followed the earthquake and what might follow, I guess, over the coming months, if anything at all.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ranj. I think for me, the sort of the starting point with how the earthquake hit Syria was that you're very correct to say that the way that the aid operations and humanitarian response to the earthquake in Syria was really no surprise at all. It was devastatingly lacking, with very serious and dire consequences on the ground. But for people who have observed Syria for quite some time, it was not a surprise. When you compare sort of the statistics of what happened in Syria to the sort of consequences in Turkey, it's only a fraction. But Syria had been subject to a decades-long civil war that had completely destroyed existing infrastructure in the areas that were most hit. So we're talking about health infrastructure, people who had been impacted by the earthquake, around 3 million in northwest Syria alone, had already been displaced multiple times. These are people who were living in shelters when the earthquake hit, and basically destroyed whatever they had left of their belongings and of their homes. I think for us, what was sort of most shocking was even the disparity in terms of the treatment of areas that were impacted in government-held Syria and in northwest Syria, which is opposition-held, and which was much more harshly impacted by the earthquake than government-held territory. And the disparity in that treatment really highlights the problems with the aid machine that's operating in Syria. Because while you had search and rescue teams rushing to government-held Syria, UN agencies and the ICRC immediately responding, even sending their highest level of delegations, including the president of the ICRC, to government-held Syria. In northwest Syria, there was absolute silence. There were no aid convoys coming in for the first few days. You only had the local search and rescue team, whose capacity did not extend beyond 5% of the impacted area. And as you know, I mean, the humanitarian response to earthquakes, time matters, right? So it's not something that you can work out in 3 days, 4 days, a week, 10 days. Like, people are dying under the rubble. And what we saw in northwest Syria was that there was no one willing to help. Part of this is due to the architecture of the UN. As you know, sort of northwest Syria, because it's not held by the government, does not receive aid does not receive the primary source of aid from UN agencies within Syria. Instead, it has to rely on cross-border operations. But unfortunately, cross-border operations had been sort of gutted by UN Security Council threats of veto by Russia. And there was only one border crossing available. But even for the first 4 days of the past the earthquake, no UN convoys crossed to northwest Syria, and it was only a week later. That the Syrian government actually approved 2 more border crossings, and that aid started flowing in. But even then, that type of aid wasn't the aid that people on the ground were requesting. There was no heavy machinery. There were no search and rescue teams coming in, and that really meant that the number of people we saw dying just kept increasing, and that's primarily and in large part due to the politicization of aid that we had seen long before the earthquake. We had continuously called for the cross-border resolution to be passed and to be expanded. We had called for policymakers to resolve the situation of northwest Syria in particular, and that didn't happen. And we saw the consequences play out very dramatically and very tragically after the earthquake hit.
And in terms of the to build on the appraisal you've just given, Sara, which was most helpful, the implications will be felt differently in different regions, or is this something which will be confined to the paralysis of, central government versus the regions versus UN procedural complexities?
So no, for sure, the repercussions of this are going to be felt very, very differently when you're talking about government-held territory and northwest Syria, which is opposition-held. Because in government-held territory, the challenges are different. One challenge was the imposition of sanctions, which both the US and the EU have made their sanctions regime more lenient in response to the earthquake. But there, the concerns are more about corruption and access and difficulties in doing reconstruction projects. In northwest Syria, the challenges are completely different. You simply don't have enough people on the ground to be able to even respond to the short-term consequences. There's no long-term plan for northwest Syria. The permission that was provided by the Syrian government for cross-border openings is only valid for 3 months. After 3 months, what's going to happen? We're still at the very basic level of trying to identify shelters for populations. We're not even at the level of talking about reconstruction or even early recovery. And those are the kinds of things that Northwest, by virtue of not being a recognized government, can't really request that sort of assistance, can't really engage external actors to build that sustainable response. So there's very much a difference in the consequences that are going to be felt by those two regions, and that's going to continue unless there's a very sustainable solution that's come to by all sides.
The final follow-up, if I may, Sara, in relation to the let's say interplay between what's happening in Turkey and Syria. Turkey, as a very critical key actor in Syria, has pretty much had a very large say on the affairs of the country as a whole, and more specifically the northwest and the northeast. Do you think there's a situation developing now where Turkey will be more consumed by its domestic affairs, the crisis domestically, to play any significant role in Syria in the aftermath of the earthquake?
So it's an interesting question because you're correct in saying that Turkey had played a huge role, particularly with regards to northwest Syria and the areas that have been most impacted. They've relied very much on Turkey for aid, for facilitation of trade, even for its diplomatic and military representation to a certain extent, has been in large part reliant on Turkey. The question then becomes, and that's what we saw in the first few days after the earthquake, Turkey being consumed by its own crisis. Syria was secondary, and there was a vacuum there. There was no one to fill it. I do believe that those areas in Syria where there's Turkish influence continue to be and play an important role for Turkey in terms of its foreign affairs, and that's going to continue to happen. What's unclear is to what extent that response is going to be reduced. It's going to remain important. It's going to be reduced significantly, I believe, but we don't know to what extent. And we don't know who's going to come in to fill the vacuum. And that's going to be an even, in my opinion, more problematic question.
Thanks very much, Sara. Peter, let's come back to you to get your reactions to what Asli and Sara have outlined. Again, I'm personally very interested in the overlap between what's happening in Turkey and Syria. But it'd be great to get your thoughts, I guess, on the, well, it'd be great to hear more on the foreign policy, wider regional dynamics of this crisis, but also to get a more concrete sense of what's really next. I think a central theme that's come from all three of you is paralysis. Paralysis as a result of politics, as a result of procedural issues, paralysis as a result of simply how these things generally develop, whether it's in Turkey or other disaster-afflicted countries and zones. What really can we expect over the coming weeks and months, beyond, you know, attempts to generate resources and aid for Turkey and to accelerate the process of reconstruction as much as possible? You're still on mute, Peter. You're on mute. Yeah.
Well, that's a lot to tackle, and I'm happy to deflect some of those questions Asli and Sara's way, but maybe I'll pick up where Sara left off with regard to the overlap between Turkey and Syria. And Sara mentioned sort of a vacuum that may emerge, at least in those parts of Syria controlled by Turkey. And the reason for that is quite clear, that, you know, sort of, Turkey inside its own borders has been overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, and is still having trouble, you know, coming up with the resources to rise to the challenge of the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding. And let me mention that, you know, the level of humanitarian assistance, I think, has actually been better, higher than the level of, you know, the emergency response. The humanitarian aid is flowing into the region. It's still not enough. There are still, you know, people who do not have enough tents, simply speaking. But in Turkey, as far at least as the, you know, the Turkish population is concerned, that humanitarian assistance will reach its intended audience. But Turkey may not have enough resources to send humanitarian assistance, to conduct sort of large-scale reconstruction efforts in northern Syria. And frankly, and I guess, you know, Asli and I keep on coming back to the elections, even if Turkey is able to provide some help to those areas, they will probably not want to publicize it, because sadly, the Syria file and the Syrian refugee file in Turkey is a very sensitive topic ahead of elections. A lot of politicians, mostly opposition politicians, have made the refugee issue the top, or well, one of the two main sort of issues on the agenda. Many opposition politicians, parties are calling on Syrians to be sent back to Syria, at least in some numbers. And so a government, sadly, a government that now shifts a large part of its relief effort to Syria, to northern Syria, might feel that it would pay the price at the ballot box. That's one dimension of this. The other dimension is inside Turkish borders. The Syrian population of the 10 provinces that were affected by this quake is, I believe, around 1.7 million. I have to double check the figures. The total population of the region is about 14 million. And in terms of access to humanitarian assistance, this is a bit of a contentious issue in Turkey. There, you know, have been reports that Syrians are discriminated against, pushed to the back of the line in terms of being able to receive emergency assistance. that is happening, but it's happening not at an institutional level, but more on a case-by-case level in some communities, but not in others. I haven't seen any evidence of, sort of institutional discrimination. And so, at least in theory, Syrians in Turkey are eligible to receive the same aid and the same quality of humanitarian assistance as Turkish citizens, which is good news. Again, in theory. But the problematic part is, and then this is what makes the Syrian population in this part of the country uniquely vulnerable to the aftermath of the earthquake, is that, if you're Turkish and you have, you've lost everything, and I'm not going to sort of underestimate the scale of the suffering across the board, but if you're Turkish and you've lost your house, you can at least start anew elsewhere. You can go and move to live with relatives in Ankara, Izmir. You can go to your village. You can try to look for jobs elsewhere. Syrians in Turkey, as you might already know, are assigned to the province where they are registered, which is to say they cannot move to another part of the country. They can travel for, I think, up to 3 months, 90 days to another part of the country. They cannot settle there. And so what the region is now faced with is a population of hundreds of thousands of Syrians who have been displaced, who are left homeless, or left jobless, but who are unable to move, who are unable to set up shop in other parts of the country. And I think also with regard to what I mentioned earlier, elections coming up, and the relief effort obviously being channeled mostly to within Turkish borders, that population of Syrians in the south of Turkey will not only be uniquely vulnerable, but probably in need of some outside assistance as well, humanitarian assistance.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Piotr. That's extremely helpful. I guess, Asli, this is a good segue to bring you in to get your reaction to that. We also had a question from a member of the audience, Khalid Khatib, who I guess in a way referred to the point you made about Ukraine taking up much of the attention and the resources of the international community and the West in particular. And we've already seen a very stark difference in terms of funding for Turkey and its recovery effort compared to the many billions of dollars expended in the war there. But I feel like there's always a tendency in the West to take your eye off one crisis, only then to come back to a much bigger crisis down the line. And from what I've gathered from all of your remarks is that the repercussions of this might right now be limited to let's say a rescue effort, a recovery effort, but the security implications of this could be in fact very significant down the line, whether that's months from now or years from now. Could you perhaps expand on the wider security implications of this crisis, whether that's domestically in Turkey, which has had its fair share of security challenges, or whether that's in Syria, where there has been significant, to put it very lightly, cross-border security challenges and issues?
I agree with you. There are beyond the human tragedy that we are seeing, beyond the suffering, there are real issues, political issues that need to be tackled collectively, internationally, I just don't see the bandwidth, particularly in Washington, within the EU. I don't see the bandwidth to get there. There was this sort of the false assumption that Syria could be contained. Sort of have a deal, a refugee agreement with Turkey, seal off the borders, and sort of not talk to the Assad regime, and sort of you can forget about Syria. Well, first of all, That's not the case, because it is a constant source of tension between Turkey and Syria, but in Turkey's relations with United States, as you know, in Turkey's internal Kurdish tensions, etc. So that's one aspect of the issue. Syria is not contained. And the kind of suffering that Sara has just described just reminded us the uncomfortable truth that I think is conveniently being out of front page news. Second issue is, of course, to sort of touch upon something Piotr has talked about in great length from the ground, but intercommunal tensions in Turkey. I think it's only beginning. We're only seeing the beginning of it. Every day, I watch a video on social media of a Syrian refugee who talks about a form of discrimination he or she has encountered, or sort of somebody claiming that Syrians are getting preferential treatment or something or another. The fact that the country is talking so much about this issue with very few voices that are coming out in support of refugees, but also in terms of dispelling some of the myths that are around this issue. No, Syrians are not given the tents that are denied to Turkish citizens. It's not true that Syrians are given preferential treatment in doctors' offices. It's not the case. In fact, Syrians are suffering more. Syrians that are in Turkey are suffering more because of these very tensions. So I think this is not going to come back and haunt us in a bigger headline-making way. You don't have to be a sort of a fortune teller to see that these intercommunal tensions, unless some measures are taken, will be tough. And I think the whole issue of the political process in Syria, what do we do? So what I hear in the West is regime change is off the table. Okay, that makes, and everything else is off the table too. Reconstruction is off the table too, and stabilization is off the, what do we do about Syria? I think we have to make some uncomfortable political choices, whether it's going back to a political process that feels really less than perfect and resembles, an interaction with some of the perpetrators of this war, or going back to a more comprehensive policy of creating sort of self-sufficient areas inside, or, pushing for Turkish Kurdish normalization, or some sort of a thought, something. But not this, which is an imperfect policy of containment that's really not able to deal with the security challenges. One area where I don't see a change in the long term is Turkish, opposition to Kurdish autonomous areas in Syria. And of course, Turkey can surprise you. And President Erdogan is he's a pragmatist, and he's shown that pragmatism. But things are aligned in the domestic equation in such a way that I think until the elections, it's hard to foresee, it's hard to imagine any thaw in relations on that front. And if the earthquake hasn't opened the door for that, I think nothing will. So then what? I think these are some very tough questions that people in Ankara really need to think, but also people in Europe and certainly in other capitals. Turkish Kurdish issue and intercommunal tensions with Syrian refugees living in Turkey, and the fact that Syria is not a country we can just leave to Russia at its mercy, at Russia's mercy, are three big Syria topics and Syria-Turkey related topics that I think require more bandwidth that is just not there. I think that, there is a bit of a Syria conversation in Washington now because of the earthquake, but with the exception, but other than that, it's just been long forgotten, to be very honest with you.
Thank you, Asli. Most helpful. Sara, I guess again that's a very useful contribution from Asli, which brings you in to sort of hone in more on the Syrian context beyond the trends and the analysis that Piotr and Asli have outlined. You know that it's a known fact that armed groups, other actors can exploit the grievances that follow human tragedies. And in Syria, we've already seen reports of Iran-aligned groups stepping in to fill the vacuum in the aftermath of the earthquake. That's been undertaken rather notably over the past 8 years or so in both Syria and Iraq, in fact, by a combination of different actors, including PKK-affiliated groups who stepped into the vacuum in Iraq when ISIS seized a number of towns and cities in the north in 2014. Is there a situation here where some of these groups will see their legitimacy enhanced, become more powerful, or is it too soon to be making any of those estimates?
I think again, it's a very difficult question because it's a question that we've been talking about Syria for quite some time. And I agree with Asli, like the earthquake has brought Syria back into focus only to remind us that we've sort of abandoned it or ignored it at least since 2020, but really since let's say 2016, 2017, when the Syrian-Russian military alliance has started to take over. And this question of these spheres of influence, right, of what's going to happen in northeast Syria that's under the Kurdish-led autonomous administration, what's going to happen in northwest Syria that's partially under opposition control and partially under sort of Turkey and Turkish-backed groups, and what's going to happen in government-held territory, which is only frankly government-held territory by name. While the government itself is very centralized and symbolic, you see multiple countries, including Iran, including Russia, with significant influence on even very localized dynamics, plus the existence of militias. Government-held Syria is also very chaotic in its own way. So it's a difficult question because thus far this very uncomfortable status quo has managed to exist and sustain itself. Northwest Syria remains Northwest Syria. It's not under government control. Northeast Syria remains under the sort of Kurdish-led autonomous administration, even though 3-4 years ago people would tell you this is not sustainable, it's going to end. It hasn't ended. And the government has I think the Syrian government has sort of succeeded in putting itself on the map, as in it's not going to go away. As Asli said, I mean, regime change is frankly just based on reality, no longer on the table. But then many of the issues that the root causes of the conflict are still there. And I think that's where the policy paralysis is coming from. You can't really proceed with sort of normalization with the Syrian government when it's been responsible for the killing of tens of thousands of individuals, the disappearance of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals, zero accountability, and zero change on the ground. I mean, the Syrian government that we know from 2011, 2012, and the one that we know in 2022 and 2023 is still more or less the same in terms of its patterns of behavior vis-a-vis its own citizens. So this idea of moving forward without addressing the root causes of the conflict, frankly, are extremely uncomfortable, particularly for the victims of the Syrian conflict, right? But also they're unsustainable because they are what led to the uprisings in the first place. And that really leaves you with the question of, so what are we going to do? You still have Northwest Syria, you still have Northeast Syria, and you still have this area that is ostensibly held by the Syrian government. And that's really the question of how do you... And I think the question really needs to start from the perspective of Syrians themselves. What's going to make things most comfortable for Syrians, even if the political solution itself is uncomfortable? And that's it's an important from my perspective, it's a very important starting point, because it just sort of reminds you that these sort of political superstructures really haven't served the Syrian population well at all, none of them. So how are you going to find an arrangement that actually serves them for once?
Thank you, Sara. One country we haven't mentioned, I guess, at all, in fact, is the US. Which is quite surprising for any discussion on Syria. How does the US feature in this, Sara, in the Syria context? I mean, it's there's been plenty of discussion on the region. Again, that's encouraging in many ways, despite the the reservations over what it actually means for both Turkey and Syria and the recovery effort. But how does the US feature in this post-earthquake, let's say, political and security order in Syria?
I mean, I think the US could still play an extremely important role if it was willing to sort of contribute its weight to the issue. Thus far, what we've seen the US do has been hold the line in terms of sort of accountability, providing humanitarian aid and support, being aligned with the cross-border mechanism. What we haven't really seen is sort of a more concerted push to resolve the humanitarian situation on the ground, particularly in northwest Syria. And I think there the US has influence within the UN Security Council to actually push for a more pragmatic, more sustainable solution, either with the UN and with the UN Security Council in particular. I think that's a role that the US should fully embrace and put its weight behind, because it is the sort of the premier donor to humanitarian operations in Syria. And that's something that we often forget. The US is responsible for the majority of the humanitarian response in Syria through the UN, and thus has a lot of influence on what those operations look like. I think it also has a role to play in sort of this stabilization of parts of northeast Syria and sort of the long-term plans there, if it's willing to sort of, again, use its weight. And what we've seen sort of from the US thus far has been a sort of a hesitancy. It sticks to the lines about human rights accountability very, very strongly, which I think is appreciated and respected. But I think there's more room for sort of action-oriented tasks.
That's excellent. Thank you, Sara. Peter, let's come back to you. Before I ask you a question, let me remind members of the audience they can chip in with their own questions and interventions. Comments are also welcome as much as questions. Peter, the sense that I've got from Asli in particular is that Turkey's recovery effort will depend significantly on external support. You've spoken to Turkish officials, the people who are on the front lines of managing the aftermath of this disaster. How much of a sense is there that this is a crisis that can only really be addressed short and long term with external support? Or are there Turkish officials, decision makers, policy makers who are quite confident in the resiliency of the country, its economy, its apparatus, the state, to manage this crisis and its aftermath?
I think if anything, it's more the latter, in that there is a sense of confidence that Turkey will be able to get back on its feet on its own. I mean, I don't want but it's still very early days. I mean, I think we're talking about reconstruction. We're not yet in the post-earthquake era. We're still, I know it's been 3 weeks, but the earthquake is still very much present, and there are aftershocks on a daily basis. Some, in excess of 6 magnitude. The focus is still heavily on the relief effort, obviously no longer on the rescue effort, and I think that's a priority. There has been, some talk at the highest levels, rebuilding President Erdogan famously asked Turks to give him a year, Turks in the region to give him a year to rebuild the region, to return, for local residents to be able to come back to their homes. I think his government might hope that some of these construction projects will kick off ahead of elections. But again, I think it's just too early to tell. It's too early to grasp the scale of reconstruction effort, the scale of displacement. And I think this is also what Asli may have alluded to earlier. The demographic shifts at play. Some of the people displaced by the quake might not come back. And that, especially in areas like Hatay, which has a Christian community, an Alawite community, even a Jewish community, is a big issue. And again, related to the issue is the question of mobility. Turks have mobility, Syrians do not. And at this rate, one can assume that if Turks move out of these areas, if Syrians remain, the demographic shifts might be, semi-permanent. But I can't give a full answer to your question because I think the debate on this has not yet been had.
And I think that's actually a very helpful answer in and of itself. The fact that it's perhaps too soon to start coming out with any, let's say, overarching comments or analysis, given the pace at which things are developing on the ground. So that's actually extremely helpful. We've got a comment from Rosemary Berry, who's asked about the role of Syrian NGOs working cross-border between Turkey and Syria. That might be one for you, Sara, to address. And secondly, the role of Gulf states in relation to humanitarian aid and diplomacy. That's perhaps one for you, Asli, and for you, Sara, to address. Let's give the floor to you, Asli, in relation to that, and maybe your wider thoughts on what's been said so far. You're still on mute, Asli.
Sorry, I don't really know the exact figures in terms of the humanitarian aid that came from the Gulf region, but I have seen comments from officials about how important and substantial that was. And one senior official told me that Saudi government has been very, very helpful. And maybe Piotr has the exact figures, but what I can say on this is, this is an opportunity for some governments to highlight to Ankara, Turkish decision makers, that they have other friends, that the idea that they're surrounded by enemies and enemies only is not the case. And they are using that. This is not to say they don't want to help Turkey. I think everyone's moved by this tragedy. And certainly, international community has been there in the past as it is now, but there's also obviously a political desire to continue the normalization path, and for Turkish society to see that Turkey is part of an international community. Same goes for European, I think, countries that are now thinking of, doing an EU drive for donations to Turkey, etc., all really also hoping to use this earthquake as an unfortunate incident, but also an opening to smooth over some of the more thorny issues. But I will have to defer to Piotr in terms of the exact sums and what he saw on the ground.
Piotr, did you want to come in response to that, or Shall we
No,
come
as
back?
far as I don't have the figures, but I mean, I can tell you that, you know, there was help pouring in from all corners. One sort of, you know, rather unprecedented example was the scale of assistance from Pakistan, of all places, and that is obviously down to, you know, Turkey's thriving relationship with Pakistan. What I did come across was a poll. This was a poll of about 1,000 Turkish residents. Were asked, you know, which country. This was a poll, I think, conducted in late February. Which country has been or could be the most helpful? Interestingly, Qatar came first of the 5 sort of entities polled. So Qatar, EU, China, USA, and UK. 26% of Turks said that Qatar has been the most helpful, the most supportive. And I think a total of 35% signaled that it was most capable of rebuilding affected areas. The EU came second with 16% and 27% respectively. And then China, 15% of Turks said that China had provided the most support, and a total of 40% also said that China was most capable of rebuilding the affected areas. Again, this does not, you know, this is not a reflection of the aid provided, but probably also the visibility of aid and obviously the rescue efforts. I mean, the Chinese were certainly on the ground in a number of places. EU teams were teams from across Europe as well. And obviously, as Asli alluded, you know, we had teams from Israel, from Greece, from Armenia, neighbors with which Turkey has had problematic relationships. So, you know, the drive for normalization was there already with Armenia, maybe less so with Greece, but certainly with Israel. And the visibility of the humanitarian assistance of the rescue teams from these countries will only have helped. But again, this is not, you know, something of a breakthrough, a tidal shift. This is, if anything, going to accelerate a process that was already ongoing.
Thanks very much, Peter. Sara, perhaps you could address the points made on Syrian NGOs working cross-border. I always feel like there's always a large cohort of unsung heroes that are actually doing their best and are actually actively engaging in the the rescue and aid efforts, but don't really get the limelight or the mentions. And perhaps this is an opportunity, I guess, to raise attention of some of the work these NGOs are doing in both Turkey and Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, organizations like SAMS, organizations like the White Helmets were really the backbone of the entire response post-earthquake and even before the earthquake, right, in northwest Syria. I mean, the White Helmets were the only search and rescue team on the ground, and they played the primary role in saving people's lives, but also organizations like Violet, like Mulham team. These are local teams that are operating in northwest Syria, relatively small in terms of the needs, but working really day and night. They are the backbone of the humanitarian response. Unfortunately, and sort of by their own admission, they're like physically incapable of like scaling up to meet what the needs that are required on the ground. And that's why they too sort of insist on UN support and UN coordination, UN supplies, just because in terms of the scale, the UN can mobilize the way a country mobilizes. And these teams, although they're dedicated and they're capable, they just can't do it to that scale. And that's why it's because they're doing their job so well that they don't receive a lot of attention and a lot of criticism, right? And they put the failures of others so starkly in contrast. I wanted to actually, a couple of comments on sort of the question of the Gulf states and humanitarian aid, because they actually played a very interesting role in the Syrian context. I don't know, a few days ago, Reuters actually reported that the reason that the Syrian government allowed the opening of the two other border crossings was because of a UAE push. The UAE was also the one that mobilized on the Syrian government side, while the Qatar Red Crescent was actually one of the few teams to send supplies and an actual medical team into northwest Syria. So even there, you see sort of an interplay in terms of the Gulf is playing a major role in the aid apparatus in Syria.
Thank you, Sara. Most helpful. We're approaching the end of the webinar. I think this would be a fantastic opportunity for each of you, maybe in a minute, ideally, just to offer a policy recommendation. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs, of course, is a policy institute, so we're always normally quite keen to end with policy recommendations. I know we've covered a lot of ground, so don't overthink it too much. But it'd be fantastic to get some last, some final remarks from you on the policy side of things and what should be done, can be done, things to watch out for. Let's start in the order. Well, let's start with you, Sara. We'll work in reverse this time.
Sounds good. Thank you. From my end, I think what the earthquake has shown is that this sort of the status of Northwest Syria is unresolved in terms of humanitarian operations has dire consequences. And so I think for policymakers looking forward, there has to be a sustainable access to humanitarian aid in Northwest Syria that's not reliant on the Syrian government's goodwill, and that's not even reliant on the UN Security Council's authorization. There has to be more. And I think the earthquake has shown us that this is sort of an urgent question that needs to be solved.
Excellent. Thank you, Sara. Asli?
I think an international donors conference for Turkey and Syria with not just governments, but both governments, of course, but also really civil society and engineering, in a sense, pushing both of these countries to be more open to external help, NGO, international organization, in return for greater sympathy from the rest of the world. I think a conference is very important and timely that should happen over the next month or two.
Should the Assad regime be represented at the conference, or are you talking specifically about Turkey, Asli?
I think it should be in return for certain guarantees, and with the understanding that they will have to change their behavior, because I agree with everything Sara has said, but the policy paralysis is there, and we need to shake up this equation. And I don't really know how to change Assad government's behavior other than, every type of sanction in the book has been tried and it hasn't changed their behavior. I'm wondering if UN step-by-step approach, or sort of the promise of being able to receive international funds with, of course, a proper surveillance and proper monitoring would be helpful in changing behavior. This is not an ideal option because the regime is responsible for what the country has gone through. But I don't really know what else to do at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Asli. Piotr, the floor is yours.
I completely sign up to what Sara and Asli had mentioned. But I would make a micro recommendation, and that obviously is in the spirit of what I was talking about earlier, which is to recognize the sort of uniquely vulnerable situation of Syrian refugees in southern Turkey, to make sure that humanitarian assistance reaches them, that they are not sort of left out, and perhaps to initiate a conversation with the Turkish government about decreasing mobility of Syrians in Turkey, and offering Syrians not only in the south but across the country greater job mobility and access to jobs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Piotr. This is the end of the webinar, but I guess not the end of the discussion. It's a topic we'll continue to engage at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, as will all of our speakers, no doubt. Please do continue to follow the discussion, follow their work via their social media accounts and elsewhere. Let me thank each of you, Piotr, Sara, Asli, for your helpful interventions and remarks. Thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedules to join us for this important webinar. And of course, a huge thank you to members of the audience for joining us. We look forward to hosting all of you once again in the very near future. Thanks very much.